There we go.
Yep,
Okay, let
recording
me
in
go
progress.
ahead and leave.
Get
All right,
out.
so we recording?
Oh my god.
Speed.
Boomer James.
Everyone clap to sync audio.
No, you don't have to do that.
Andy, you have to clap.
Doesn't
I
count.
was gonna clap really loud, but then I'll wake up my children. So I'm not gonna do that.
That'll be the last clap you ever do.
Mhm.
Yeah, right. Okay. So Aboleths.
Well, do you guys want to, should we do kind of a little intro first? Talk about how long you've been playing and what you primarily do, what you like to do? Just as just to kind of have?
Sure.
Yes.
So the three of us have all been playing since high school. I'd say we started in the early aughts, all the way back to 2004, when the world wasn't on fire and disease didn't run rampant. At least not the disease we're all familiar with now. But we've been playing for a while, and primarily I was a player back then. And since then, I have run as a DM several games for family and friends, and recently have started a Dungeons and Dragons club at the school that I teach at, and having a lot of fun with it. And so, yeah, been having a good time with the game so far. And I would say that we started on 3.5 and have since kind of converted over to 5e, like most people have nowadays. And it's been a good time.
What other games and systems are you familiar with, James?
I'd say D&D is kind of my bread and butter. I mean, I've played a couple of Call of Cthulhu games. I think when we played in high school that one time with our other friend, was it White Wolf? Was it World of Darkness? Was that it? Was that what it was?
World of Darkness.
Okay. Excuse me. So I would say that those are definitely ones that I've experienced, but I also really like playing just other random board games. A lot of the popular ones that are out, like Betrayal at Baldur's Gate is a great one.
Scrabble.
Also, yeah. So super fun. Nick, what about you?
So I think I was the last to come to the role-playing table out of the three of us. I started playing with both of you guys when you introduced me to it I actually think it was like 8th grade was the first time that we played together. And it was D&D 3.5, and I thought it was cool because you could make a character that could backflip. Like Gomez Adams. So that was really the goal for my first character, was to be able to do consecutive backflips out of a tavern.
That's what you did the first time you played.
I did, but then I got beat up and shoved in a dumpster afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that was a really weird way to end the session, is when we all walked out of the house and then somebody was like, "You nerds playing D&D," and then immediately beat Nick up and put him in a dumpster.
Right. Unfortunately, the backflipping doesn't work in real life. So we played. I played 3.5 all throughout high school. I had a few sessions of White Wolf, like the World of Darkness. I really didn't like it the first time that I played it. I I don't think that is. I think that's partly the system. It's like such an opposite. It's such an opposite method to D&D. Like D&D is so team based, and it's so power fantasy, and everyone's working together, and it's very combat based. And World of Darkness is so open and can be so political, and there's so much intrigue, and it almost supports playing against each other, which I'm not a huge fan of. And then I've also played D20 Modern, D20 Past, which I think are both really fun and kind of looked over a lot. I love Call of Cthulhu. I think it's probably my favorite now. But yeah, I played 4E as well, which we all played when they converted. Wasn't a huge fan of that, and 5E is I mean, what can you say? It's so streamlined, it's so accessible. So yeah, and I think that we all kind of talked a lot about monsters and about the monsters that we kind of like wished we had, all the monsters we wished had exposed themselves to us in school. And wait a second, can we edit? And so yeah, you guys had the idea to do this and kind of do like a little monster meet and chat, kind of talk about them and strategies and stuff and how you would use them. I also started a like dungeon mastering, game mastering business, and now I do that for people. So yeah, Andy.
Yep. And I'm the least qualified out of the three of us, although I started probably before everyone else. I started playing D. What?
Which is especially disappointing to
Yeah,
the
it
two of
is.
us, considering you've had the most amount of time to get good at this.
Yeah. I started at a nerd camp in Massachusetts, so college academy, where summer camp was playing Dungeons and Dragons and Magic the Gathering. And that's where I learned how to play.
I'm actually surprised that that camp didn't have like a self-defense section too. That was like, hey, I know we're here to be nerdy stuff, but if you're going to be doing all this stuff, you might also want to have some of this as well.
Here's what you do when someone tries to steal your Pokemon cards.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So did that with my good friend Alex Munoz at the time. And me and him basically just played D&D through middle school, and then got James on the bandwagon. We played at Alex's house early on, and then dragged Nick into it, and so played since middle school, and mostly dungeon mastered because no one else likes to do that. And I like to create stories in my head and live vicariously in another world that isn't the one I'm currently living in.
Literally any other one. Yeah, any other one will do. Please take me away from my children.
But it also helps because I can do the world myself, opposed to have to live in someone else's imagination world. So yeah. So I don't know. I mean, we're all pretty well experienced dungeon masters.
I would say
the most experience, but Nick's probably the most professional at it.
For sure. I would say we're all pretty experienced with 3.5 and 5e. But I think one thing I've learned since this D&D boom that we've kind of been experiencing for the past decade or so is how much I actually didn't know about the game, right? Like if you had asked me 10 years ago, like, are you an expert about D&D? I'd say like, yeah, absolutely. But now that there's so many podcasts out and like really like people who dive full into the history of all this stuff, like the history of Forgotten Realms and the history of Greyhawk and like, I mean, my God, if you had asked me what the main setting was for D&D back in 2005, I would have no idea what you were talking about, right? Like
dungeon?
Right. Like all I would know is what the world that Andy came up with in the original game.
Yep. I think that's the reason. So, and I've realized that now too, is we played our own way.
Yeah.
And we didn't really know. And now that we listen to these other D&D podcasts and everyone plays in a certain way, and we're like, oh wow, I'm always like so surprised how people are playing it. I'm like, oh yeah, we played it like this, you know?
Yeah,
So
I
Right.
did. I was completely unaware that there is kind of a canon
mhm.
um, history to these things. That there is like there are books, there are like card games, there's all sorts of canonical history between like race relations and monsters and wars and all this stuff. And like I wasn't aware of any of that. So it's funny because like I'll do games with kids a lot, and they get so into it, but they don't really have, they're not in the place where like one of them can run a game for the other one because they all want to play. So instead they just become like sponges for all of this information that's out there. And they'll be like, oh my gosh, they'll run into a drow in the game and everyone will be like, is that Drizzt, the famous like
Right. Yeah, right.
drow wizard adventurer that was
Yeah.
evil turned good, whatever, and they'll rattle all this stuff about Drizzt and all of their adventures and yeah, like they know the stories to everything. And I think we were very like sheltered in term, like we played a lot, but
Mhm.
it was all very homebrewy, I think.
Well, right. And I think, so much of that was like the content that we were taking in at the time was just from the books. I mean, to sound like a elderly curmudgeon, right? Like we only had the books when we were like, if you wanted a new race, you better be willing to convince your parents to drive you to Borders, and you better
Mhm.
hawk up that $30 to buy, Races of the Wild or whatever, or like whatever, whatever
Boo.
it was. Um,
Boo's right.
and that maybe that's a whole episode in and of itself, is to revisit some of the stuff and some of those old books that I actually have. Um,
Review
and
how Borders used to be a bookstore.
yeah, review Borders. 0 out of 5 stars. That it's now an abandoned. There's only abandoned stuff. I can't go in and use the nice smelling bathroom that they always
And
had.
say it's a place where young teens get arrested in high school for breaking into.
Everyone's so fucking horny for all the Drizzt fan fiction that they've
Yeah,
hid in
yeah.
Borders now.
Right. But
Mhm.
I maybe that's a whole episode in and of itself, is just like, since you're playing with the younger generation and I'm playing with the younger generation now with my students, and just seeing how they're at with starting the game versus where we were at with starting the game. But Andy, back to your point in visiting a imaginary fantastical world, we will start with our first monster, the Aboleth, a monster known for creating imaginary planescapes inside their enemies' minds with their phantasmal force ability, as well as some others. So we're going to dive into the Aboleth today and kind of have a conversation. And one thing that we want to focus on in this podcast is we're not going to go over the stats so much on these monsters. They might come up, we might talk about them, but the real goal for this conversation is to be about, how do you see this monster being used in a campaign setting? How do you see maybe this monster in a one shot, in a maybe like a 3-shot adventure of sorts? How could you see them fitting into the story that you're creating at the table, whether it's in a module or whether it's in some kind of homebrew setting? So for anyone listening to this, thinking about the Aboleth, uh, Aboleths are these really weird primordial creatures. Just taking the first snippet from the monster manual here. It says, before the coming of the gods, Aboleths lurked in primordial oceans and underground lakes. They reached out with their minds and seized control of the burgeoning life forms of the mortal realm, making those creatures their slaves. Their dominance made them like gods. Then the true gods appeared, smashing the Aboleth's empire and freeing their slaves. Aboleths have never forgotten. And my my immediate reaction to this is like, you never hear about Aboleths. I don't think I've ever seen an Aboleth used ever. So in my mind, that paragraph reads as if the Aboleths think that they're hot shit, and the gods are like, Aboleth who? Have I met you before? like like that is who the Aboleth is in my mind, like to the gods. Like I feel like they're so propped up to be the enemy of the gods. They remember the time when they were the most powerful beings. Meanwhile, they are the first monster. They're the first monster that you can actually fight at challenge rating, what? Challenge rating 10, I think. That has legendary actions. Other than that, I think like a unicorn, like or like I think a unicorn might have some legendary actions, but like this is the first evil thing that you can fight. So to me, that's just hilarious. I just think that that's so funny.
Yeah, I kind of get the sense like that very like Greek mythology, like before the gods, like the Titans like ruled, and then they just kind of ripped it from that. And it's interesting since they're considered an aberration. They're basically an alien, so it's kind of like I think it's kind of a cool concept.
I think it's a really neat monster. And I should also mention this with the podcast too. We are not ones to dive into like the history of D&D and like who came up with like what is a D&D original versus what is something they stole from another source or whatever. Like that's not really the focus of the podcast. We're really here just to talk about how we think the monster fits and what we think is interesting about the monsters in general. So if you have other information, that's awesome. That's great. If we might mention things during the podcast, you're like, wow, they took it from this, or this was the concept, or like, that's great. That's awesome. But they're just kind of our first thoughts as we look at some of these monsters and revisit them. I totally agree. I think it's a really cool monster. I just think that idea of just like they just seem like such an afterthought to the gods, but to them it's such a big deal.
Yeah.
Nick, what are you thinking? What are your first thoughts around the Aboleth?
I'm actually I'm going to be the outlier, as I will for almost anything that is intelligent and lives in the ocean. I will be a big Lovecraftian fan of, because these things terrify me, and they're obviously totally ripped from Lovecraft stuff. It reminds me of Dagon, actually, if you guys have ever read that. But I've actually used an Aboleth before. I think that this is like a really bad picture in the monster manual of it, just because it I don't really know what they're trying to do here. Like Aboleths are they're like infamously intelligent, I think is supposed to be kind of what separates them. They're that and their ego. And the picture it makes it look kind of like a leech, just like a big leech with tentacles. It doesn't. It just kind of looks like bestial. I think the old picture from 3.5.
It's very lamprey, like lamprey-esque, hagfish-esque.
Right. I think the picture from 3.5 was like this very. It was like this odd mucusy looking whale, which I liked, and
yeah, go do the Google image search on it too.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Hold on a sec.
No, just type in Aboleth. Don't do 5e. Yeah,
I think there's a lot of really neat art depictions of them.
Yeah,
the Forgotten Realms, that one. But I like that one, the ancient aberration one.
Oh yeah, that's
Bell
terrifying. Which one?
The Bell of Lost Souls one. Top right. Yeah.
Oh yeah, very nice.
That's a cool one.
So, oh yeah, very creepy. I like that a lot. Like something about that is much more terrifying. This one has like 7 eyes and a mouth and these strange holes for the gills. So I think Aboleths are interesting because they kind of fall into this cool category where it's like it could be the big big bad guy for like for a low to moderate, I guess like moderate level campaign, or if it was a high level campaign, it could be a mid level boss, because I think it's only a challenge rating like 12. No, 10. So lower than I thought. I like that they're really smart. I like that their abilities are psychic. I like that the enslave thing I think is interesting. Isn't this the one that like makes that is guarded by like those mucusy, like the scums, right?
They normally are. That's the old Aboleth, guarded by the
Right,
scum
because
slaves.
this one had right. So this one does have the enslave ability, which is pretty cool. But it doesn't. Yeah, and it has a probing telepathy, learns their greatest desires, stuff like that. Like this lends itself to being a really interesting role playing kind of monster. I
Yeah,
don't
like a main
see
bad guy too.
For
Like the
sure.
main
right.
villain.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. I mean, I don't see it being used much outside of like a watery themed or water adjacent,
And
campaign.
I think that's what ultimately why we don't see it more often. And why other monsters are kind of chosen is because it's so tied to that underwater or aquatic theme almost, right? Like and I think I would almost like to see a version of the Aboleth made that is tied to like different elements almost, so you could almost like see it in different settings, right? Like I would love to see a burrowing Aboleth, right? Especially if there's these ancient beasts, right? Something that can burrow, or maybe fly, or something along those lines almost. I could see, just so you can get a little bit more versatility out of the Aboleth, because I think not having it in an aquatic setting often pushes it away from your thought process, because you're like, oh well, like my characters are in the mountains right now, where are they going to find an Aboleth, you
Well,
know?
I partially agree with you, but I think what makes this really easy to do is that any underground city, which kind of lends itself to this kind of creature like ancient being, an ancient city,
Sure. And
could be
actually,
partially underwater, and that
I
could
want
be
to
in a mountain, it could be anywhere.
jump on that for a second, Andy, because one of the things that jumps out to me is that Aboleth layers are often in subterranean lakes or rocky depths of the oceans, often surrounded by the ruins of ancient fallen Aboleth cities. What do you think an Aboleth city looks like? Like, looking at their physiology, looking at these like weird lamprey fish people, what is an Aboleth city?
We're everyone's just underwater, and they're still going to stores and buying like bread and like if
Well,
you're
and
like the
Soggy,
Aboleth that
soggy slime bread.
like
Yeah,
these challenge
yeah.
rating 10 creatures that used to challenge the gods, and now like one is working at the Aboleth CVS and the other one is working at
Or even better yet,
he's working as an Aboleth teacher at the school, like doing after school with all the little Aboleths.
and I want to see the Aboleth suburbs, right? Like where
Right.
like one Aboleth comes out with a mustache and he's like, morning Bob, getting out
Right.
taking your slime trash out, I see today.
Mowing the seaweed.
Yeah.
Right. They're all competing for better lawns with each
Right.
other.
This seems like a Rick and Morty episode. Like this
Yeah,
is
really.
but I just
But what
that
I
idea
think
of Aboleth cities popped. But I think that is a really neat idea for an exploration, right? It's like, what is an Aboleth city as a DM? Like, how do you envision that being? Is it tunnels? Is it structures?
So I think this is a kind of a cool thing. This is kind of what I saw, and this is how I would do it if I was going to do an Aboleth city, right? Is you have to think they were the creatures before the gods, right? So, think of an ancient city like maybe Mayan flavor of some sort, or Aztec flavor, like the large stone temples, stuff like that, where residing in this large temple is the Aboleth, and really the city is made up of its slaves. right? So I
Right,
think that'd be
right,
kind
right.
of a cool thing. And what makes it different, right? Everyone's like, well, the city seems kind of normal, but everyone acts a little bit weird. And then, as they mentioned in the Aboleth, like as a layer, um, over time, like the regional effects that it has, like
Mhm.
surfaces are slimy and wet, like wet with mucus, water sources are foul, so it could just be something where it's like, hey, like this city, everyone's drinking this nasty water. And it's like, oh, well, is the water causing people to be weird or what's going on? It's kind of this like
Yeah.
intrigue thing to where you finally realize, hey, it's this crazy like elder god almost, causing it. It'd be a great fight. That's what I would do.
Yeah, I think that's very cool. I think that lends itself to a lot of interesting like paranoia themes and again like I'm harping on this a lot because it fits so well for this, but that is like that idea of going into this town, right, and being like something's not right here. There are these like everyone seems kind of touched by this other sort of consciousness or this strange otherworldly thing, and with the ocean themes, like that is like a classic Lovecraftian sort of story element. I love the idea of going into this town, uh and everyone seems sort of normal and the players kind of like unraveling more of the mystery of what's going on. And and I think like even though the Aboleth is only a challenge rating 10, which does seem kind of on the lower end for like big bosses, I think that with its lair actions and having like a mini campaign or something around this sort of like city or wherever it is, like you could also adapt it to be like, I could also see Aboleth like being the head of a thieves guild but running it from like the sewers, right, where there is
Yeah.
this sort of
Yeah.
watery kind of
Kind of if
place
you're
that it's in.
playing an aquatic game, you're doing Baldur's Gate, but it's on the coastline type of a thing. It replaced the Beholder with an Aboleth for running the Thieves Guild.
Right, or even like maybe it found its way uh from the harbor into the sewers when it was young and grew up, and now it's like really big in there and now has like gotten control over the sewers or something. But my point is that like even though it's a relatively lower challenge rating for a big boss, I think like um you can make it punch above its weight so much more effectively by putting it in a place where it has all of like a very strong established reign, like over a group, either maybe a small group like a thieves guild or maybe even a whole town or a whole city like Andy was saying.
Right. And I definitely think you're right, Nick, in the sense that there are ways that the Aboleth um could make itself more powerful, like politically in a city too.
Mm.
Because I'm looking at the enslave ability, right? And you're magically charmed until the Aboleth dies or it leaves that plane of
Yeah, it's
existence.
crazy.
So almost imagine like a child gets lost in the sewers, right? And then is charmed by this Aboleth, and the Aboleth almost prompts this child like a mentor. They're telepathically listening to rumors and stuff throughout the city. So now they're kind of like using this child as their proxy. And as that
Mm.
child comes up to power within the town, they become the town guard, and then they become the mayor, or something along those lines. And it's like all of a sudden, like this Aboleth living in the sewer is actually the puppeteer
Yeah.
of the king or whatever, just because that's the child that fell into the sewer at that point in time, right? And what happens when that kid's realized that they've been magically charmed by this thing um for its entire livelihood, right? Like what does that look like? You know, that just strikes me in the enslavability. So I do think, or does that to multiple children and has one become a very powerful wizard and one become, like, you could almost imagine an entire adventuring party that's been enslaved by an Aboleth over time,
Be
you
an
know?
interesting rivalry group,
Oh yeah.
Ooh,
like a
yeah, that would be
rivalry
kind of neat.
party.
Sure.
The creepy and interesting thing to me too with the Aboleth is that like the charmed effect with the enslave ability, whenever the target takes damage, they get to make a new saving throw against it. So it's in the Aboleth's best interest to sort of like protect its enslaved ones, which gives it this like almost kind of perverse parental instinct.
It's like the
where it like
Aboleth is like
wants
almost
to
it's like gaslighting almost, you know? In a sense that it's trying to like, it's like, no, I'm here to protect you, you know?
Yeah, well, and that kind of connects to its probing telepathy, where
Love that ability.
yeah, it learns that's just such a great role playing thing. It learns the creature's greatest desires if the Aboleth can see it, and I feel like there's not a lot of those abilities given to creatures in 5e. Like so many of the abilities are like pin, or like you can take a bonus attack if you like grapple with it or something. But probing telepathy is like, that's such a great frightening ability to give against your players,
For sure.
And the cool part with the Aboleth too is it's hyper intelligent, hyper charismatic, and really wise, like stat wise, right?
Right.
And so like clearly scheming is a thing that you'd put into it, like knowing its greatest desires, being able to charm people. It just leads itself to this kind of cultish like following.
Right. And from a DM
yeah.
perspective, being able to use phantasmal force to create your player's most wanted thing, right? Their most wanted desire, and specifically target that with phantasmal force. So I two things that come to my mind as we're having these conversations is, one, if you're going to use an Aboleth, you really need to know your story, your character's backstories, right? Like if you are going to if you're going to probe into your party's minds and get their greatest desires, you need to know what that player's greatest desire is for that character, like or at least have an idea, if they have a lost sister, like finding their sister, or something along those lines. Like you need to be able to kind of have notes on that to use it effectively, I think. And the other thought that came to mind was this eternal memories ability that it has, right? Like they have a flawless memory. Literally, they're passing on information from generation to generation, like photographic memory. So I can almost imagine being, like if your party needs some kind of information, if you want to give a quest and you want to feature an Aboleth, like if your party is seeking the secret to fighting the big bad, or if they're trying to find the secret to a location of something, instead of using the Sphinx or something like that, that's kind of been used a whole bunch, and you want to throw something different at them, the Aboleth is a great avenue to do that, right? Like it adds that level of horror that maybe the Sphinx doesn't quite have. And sending your party off to be like, well, there's tales of a monster in the lake, and this monster supposedly knows everything, like that could be a really neat quest. And
I love that. I love the idea of it being not necessarily even an enemy, but maybe even the way that the DM spins it, maybe even an ally, where the Aboleth knows something or remembers something very ancient that the players need to know, and like, God, you can only imagine what the Aboleth would want in return for that kind of information. And even then, it's like, can you ever trust something that is so self-serving, so intelligent, so charismatic? And the other thing I just wanted to point out that I think is really unusual about it is how high its passive perception is. It's
good luck sneaking up on this thing.
Yeah, or like sneaking anything, like that's really incredible. And a +6 for the +6 for the wisdom save is really really high too. It's not easily deceived either.
Yeah, if you're
The-
coming in expecting to enchant or charm this thing like into your submission, it's just not going to happen. Or at least you can't bank on it.
Yeah. The other cool ability I thought it had too, and I don't know if you guys looked at it, was the disease it can give.
Yeah.
And basically you get diseased and your skin turns like transparent and mucousy. And basically you can't heal unless you're in water, which I think is kind of a cool thing. Like,
Yeah.
especially if like the enslaved people, like I'm thinking back to like that enslaved city, like all of them like are like, in bathtubs or like standing in buckets of water or something.
Oh, that's so
Just be
gross.
so,
Yeah.
and it's like all this mucusy stuff too. Like I think
Yeah.
like playing with that as like a flavor, right? Pun intended. For the mucus, it's like
mucus, my favorite flavor.
Yeah.
yeah. I think that's like a good descriptor. I think that can keep being used when you're describing it,
Yeah.
and the things around it.
Do you guys want to talk about its combat abilities a little bit? I feel like we've talked a lot about its special abilities, kind of its role playing stuff. Do you guys want to talk about what it actually would be like to get into a combat situation with this thing?
Yeah, let's do it.
So it's got it makes three. So it has multi attack, which like any good monster will have. It has 3 attacks, which I feel like is pretty high. Obviously, its primary thing, if you're just looking at it, you're gonna figure out is the tentacles. It's got a +9, which I feel like is pretty good. It does a decent amount of damage, but really, I think the special the special piece de resistance for that is each of those tentacle attacks, you have to make a DC 14 Constitution saving throw or become diseased. That means it gets you, and if it's attacking the same target, if you're just spamming attacks on the same character, they have to make 3 14s at least in a right, like 3 times, or or they get the I think it's the same thing, the mucus cloud thing, right?
Yep.
They can't regain hit points unless it's in water. Yeah.
And when they're out of water, they take acid damage every 10 minutes.
Right.
The thing that I think is interesting about the tentacle attack too is that it has reach for 10 feet.
Right.
Which, is always more scary when you're trying to fight something tactically, right?
Especially when you look at the only hope you really have of dealing damage to this thing is, or at least a spellcaster, is to target its dex, right? Is to use the spells that focus on dexterity saving throws.
That's what I was gonna say when I was gonna say we should talk about like weaknesses too, like strategies that you would you would make.
So along that same lines, as far as strategy goes, my other point to that though is that an Aboleth is smart enough to know that those types of spells are going to target it. So when it starts enslaving individuals, it's going to have, like, if you really want to, give your players a challenge, it's going to have a caster there with counterspell ready to go. Right, every single time that fireball or chain, like chain lightning. Well, because here's the thing, right? Is I think it's used by players like religiously, for sure, and for very good reasons. But I think a lot of times DMs forget that they can use it too. When you're fighting an enemy, it's, especially if it's like, well, yeah, they're going to counterspell your counterspell. Like that would happen, and that gets into those kind of like arcane duel type of ideas. And an Aboleth would know to counter. It's lived long enough. It's I'm sure fought casters or things in the past, so it's going to have that knowledge. So I think another point that we might want to talk about after its abilities. Well, we'll get there. I have another thought on this, but that kind of prompted that thought in my mind. I also look at its lair actions as well, right? Phantasmal Force, which is a pretty decent spell. It can really, if you especially describe it right, it can do some pretty good damage. And it covers a pretty good area. So if you have your party grouped up, you can get a lot of them in one go. As well as this one's interesting to me. The pools of water within 90 feet of the Aboleth surge outward in a grasping tide. Any creature on the ground within 20 feet of such a pool must succeed on a 14 strength saving throw or be pulled 20 feet into the water and knocked prone. So not only are you now dealing with the effects of fighting underwater, possibly, but you're also knocked prone.
Well, the Aboleth will want you to fight. So you see it's weaker out of water. It has a 10-foot speed and then a 40-foot swim speed. Obviously, it's going to want to stick you in the water. A lot of its other powers, like the mucus cloud, makes more sense in the water, as well as the layer action for like where they get psychic damage when they're inside the water as well. So there's just a lot of reasons why the Aboleth would want to fight there instead of on the ground.
Is there? I'm not as familiar with lair actions. Can you switch the lair action every round?
So
yeah, it's on initiative count 20. So depending on where the order is, every single time it hits 20, you can either keep it or you can change it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And I think some monsters actually have, like, don't they have some lair actions if they're more powerful that happen on counts 20 and 10?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So you can do two
That's
things. I mean,
incredible.
that's like higher level stuff. But let's talk about this. So this is the other thought I had. If you were having your party fight an Aboleth, what would you pair the Aboleth up with? Because I feel like oftentimes as GMs, we can't just have one monster there. There needs to be a puzzle, or there needs to be another monster, or there needs to be a combination of monsters that kind of creates an extra challenge to the situation. So like having another caster
the boss
there,
battles.
right?
What do you think, Nick? Nick's the master of the boss
What would you
battles.
pair with the Aboleth?
I was already crafting what I would do for it right now.
Like a fine wine, you know?
Right. I would craft. I have this cool image of like, if my players were going to go down and fight an Aboleth, I think it'd be really fun to do kind of like this subterranean cave sort of thing, in almost like a whack-a-mole type situation where there are these several large like holes that are a water network underneath, where the Aboleth can kind of pop out of, right? Do its tentacle attacks or its enslave thing, try and drag them. And then as soon as it finishes its move, like pop back down under and could use its Phantasmal Force ability. And then, you've got two Aboleths popping out of two other holes and you don't know which one is the real one. And, I think that could be a lot of fun with like dragging the players into those holes, the Aboleth popping up in different places, like utilizing the water network. I wouldn't do a battle where I force my players to like be in this music is so loud. I wouldn't do like a water battle where it is solely like where I force the players to be underwater, and I also wouldn't do it at like the community pool where like there's clearly only one place the Aboleth is, you know what I mean? Like, well, it's definitely in there. But I would want to use its mastery of the water in an interesting way, because I think the scariest part of fighting like these big underwater creatures is like not knowing really what they're doing when they're under there, right?
Well, that's the fear of, like the fear of deep water anyway. Like I have a immense fear of deep water. Like I love swimming and stuff, and I'm fine with swimming in the ocean. But if you get me on a boat and you take me like off into like way off the coast, like a mile off the coast.
You wouldn't even get me on the boat.
Right? And like to jump into the water from there is terrifying. And like my dad's done it. Like my dad sails and he, he's been a mile or two off the coast along New England here. And I've gone on the boat with him when he's done that. And I'm like, how do you even? Like just the idea of, is that what it's called?
Yeah, I was just looking it up. Because I have the same thing, thalassophobia.
Right.
Thalassophobia, yeah.
Like the idea of just like what is under there. Like there's no way I could ever touch the bottom, like that to me is just terrifying.
And now we know.
The thing that I would do too, so I would do either like, I think the sewers idea is really cool that Nick brought up, where there's different like, what's the word, like different holes that it can kind of come out of, but like
chambers
in different directions, which I think would be kind of cool.
Oh.
But the other part that I would heavily rely on too, which I think would be kind of a cool morality thing for the parties to do, because I like doing that stuff, is that the psychic drain ability it has, the charmed creatures, he can psychically damage them to regain health. So what I would do is probably have some kind of ability to like shut the Aboleth off from like kind of getting like environmental damage of some sort. But as that happens, he like starts draining the life force of maybe the villagers or something that you're trying to save. So it's kind of like, how do you do that? Do you save the villagers? Do you try and break them out? Kind of like give that as like a puzzle of some sort.
Well, I really like that ability for the Aboleth, because like it doesn't have, I wouldn't say it has a crazy amount of hit points. It's got 135, which is obviously good, but that's not like there's tanks that have higher hit points. So that's kind of the Aboleth's only method of healing itself. But it is kind of a double-edged sword for the Aboleth, because once it does that, like you're right, it deals the damage and it can heal itself, but damaging the charmed creature allows the creature to redo its wisdom saving throw, possibly allowing the enslaved condition to end on it again.
But what villager is racking up 10 hit points?
Oh, that's a really good point. That's true.
So that's kind of the way I would do it.
Well, it's interesting. So here's a rules thing. How would you do it? They take 3d6 psychic damage, right? And the Aboleth regains hit points equal to the damage the creature takes. So, but the NPCs, right, are usually dead at 0. So would you allow the damage beyond 0 to count for, like, technically the person would be dead, but would you allow the damage past that, the Aboleth to heal that?
Yeah, I would. That would be a dependent on how well the party's fighting the monster.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, totally. It is. I think there's a great meme out there that was like my players frantically trying to min-max their characters so that way they can deal as much damage as possible, and then it's like the DM over there laying on the couch knowing it can add as many hit points or take away as many hit points as they want.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like it totally doesn't matter. It's like whatever the flow of combat is. Like, oh, you feel bored now, I guess it has 50 less hit points, so we can get to it. What is it, 2 a.m. And I got work the next morning. It looks like
it's the Andy special.
Yeah, exactly. Get the DM tired enough to win the battle.
Yeah, right. I agree. I didn't even think, like, the whack-a-mole idea I think is awesome. I would totally do it that way. I also think part of the combat with the Aboleth needs to be about who have they already enslaved. Right? Like, you really need to think about who is going to be in that chamber that the Aboleth is going to use as fodder against you. Right? And I think if I were a DM, I would, especially if in the storyline I had crafted, made it so that way this was a long-term slave of the Aboleth, I would I would hand wave the whatever it takes damage, he gets another save at that point, right? Like they've been so brainwashed, they've been so entrenched by, like, they almost don't know what it's like to not be around the Aboleth and have its power on them. So
They
I
have
think I would,
Stockholm and they
right, yeah,
love the
basically.
Aboleth.
Yeah, I
Like,
mean,
no,
like,
my
basically.
mucusy daddy.
I think that's one of the story things that I would just hand wave, and I would say, like, anyone who's been enslaved within the past, like, maybe week or however long you want to say it is, but for anything longer than like a month, or to a year, I'd be like, nah, this is permanent. Like, you are just
So
permanently enslaved.
Well, you could
I
also you could give them disadvantage. I mean,
Yeah, or something like that. You could give a disadvantage, but I think I would have somebody in there that is politically involved with whatever the party's trying to do, whether it's a town guard, whether it's a clergy member of a church or something, and I think that would be part of the combat as well.
so I partially agree with you, James. I think the cool part with that would be as if the party realizes, hey, if we hurt these people, they'll wake up and not help them anymore, because that could be the way to beat them. But I think what would be a cool idea is that maybe the head person or like the head priest or something was like, hey, this, because the Aboleth knows their greatest desires. It's a very smart creature, right? But if it's like you damage them, break them out of the charm, and he's like, no, this Aboleth has done so much for me. I am with him. And
oh my
it's that
gosh,
twist
Right.
that
Yeah.
makes the party be like, oh, like an oh shit moment. I like
Yeah,
those kind of.
I had the same thought, right? Like, you are entrenched to the point where it's like, it's not even enslavement anymore. Like, I am in
Mhm.
lockstep with you.
yeah.
Um,
And then that's the moral quandary, right, for stuff like that. And this is getting to a bigger conversation, but like the like so much of D&D, I feel like can be very black and white, right? Like, it's a vampire, we have to kill it, or it's a werewolf, we have to kill it, or we have to turn it back, whatever. But like, having that situation, and then where this priest or this person, right, or whomever is like, no, don't kill this Aboleth. Like, either it's done so much for me, or it will do so much for me.
Right.
It's going to tell me the secret spell I need to, like, bring back my loved one or something. I
Yeah.
don't want you to fight it. Then at
all
that
this
point,
all this knowledge that you're just killing, like,
right,
you could see a wizard just wanting to protect it as, like, this is an archive. Or
right,
oh, that's a really neat idea.
Mhm.
What if a school of wizardry was built off of an Aboleth's memory, right? Like,
Yeah.
that is their
Sick.
archive. You know, I just that thought just popped into my head with that conversation, Nick. Like, that would be really cool.
Mhm.
That all the knowledge that this clan of wizards or this religion has comes from an Aboleth.
yeah, that's interesting too. And it's like, well, this an evil creature? I mean, like, yes, right? Like,
Technically, yes.
that's
That's
what
what the book says.
that's what our
Right.
online book says, and that's what all of its abilities. I mean, it literally has an ability called enslave. I don't think you can argue it's doing it for moral reasons, but that's where you get into the argument, right? Of like, well, these wizards are like keeping it there, barely feeding it, whatever. Maybe it's like horribly tortured or whatever, and they're just using it and siphoning knowledge from it. Like, does this thing deserve to be free? And like, that's a bigger thing, and the players are like, should we get involved? The point I wanted to make earlier, I always love when games do this, because it's so difficult for the players, and I don't think there's ever a right answer, is when it is the question of like, should we get involved? Is this our business? When no one is really asking for it to happen. Like, I always think to the Strahd, that early Strahd thing, where like you go to the priest, and he has his son locked up, and like, what's going on with the son, right? Like, the son is a
Zombie.
vampire.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, this. The son is a werewolf. He's saying, "I'm hungry for blood. I love bats," and everyone's like, "He must be a werewolf." Um,
Why can't I see
and
myself in this mirror?
why can't I see myself in this mirror? Ew, garlic pizza. No, take it away. I'm a werewolf. Uh, so everyone, literally everyone knows. The priest is even like, he's not a vampire, whatever. But like, but he's like, I love him, and I want to keep him there, and I'm going to change him back or something. And it's like, does the party get involved? The priest doesn't want you to do it. Like the son obviously doesn't want you
Right.
to do it. No one's asking the group to do this, but like, why is it their responsibility? Should they, do it?
Yeah, this whole town has benefited from ancient Aboleth technology that has like saved
Right.
their people. If we kill it off now, he's not going to tell us how it works anymore, and then we're all screwed. Like, yeah, I definitely like that idea, Nick. Wow, the Aboleth. Okay.
Wait, did you guys read that they don't die?
Yeah, it said something about that. It was like something about memories for aeons and
Well, no, if it dies, its spirit goes to the elemental plane of water, which is weird because it's not a
yeah.
elemental, it's a aberration. But its body just basically coalesces again.
Into water?
No, back into an aboleth.
What?
Yeah.
I would not have that be the reality.
Although I would say that would be an interesting reoccurring villain, right? Like,
I would hate
have an Aboleth.
Yeah.
Well, we all hate the reoccurring villain, right? Like we all, we both
I
we
love it.
we love
I
it.
love it.
We love it, and we love to
There's
hate
the only
it, right?
villains I use.
Like,
My villains never die.
so I think, yeah, just like any Marvel character.
Right.
So I will say that as best as we could have, we tried to unravel the Aboleth's mysteries, just as the ocean has its mysteries. But we're unable to. There's just a million possibilities, right? Like there's just I had a thing.
Conversation.
I had a
and
deep
just
thing, and
blew it up.
then just like I suspect this podcast will be, where we start off with some deep conversation, then it'll eventually devolve into me not knowing what I'm talking about, just like so much of life.
Like the Aarakocra.
like the Aarakocra.
I can't wait
Yes.
till we get to the Aarakocra.
Well,
the Aarakocras.
we'll get there someday. But bird people, I will say that I think it's unanimous that across the board here at I don't know, Monster Meets, Monster Talk, whatever we're gonna call this thing.
I'm already calling it Gleep Glossary.
We
Gleep
can't.
Glossary.
We'll get
sued.
We'll get sued.
Ooh, what
by
about
movies?
I was gonna say, what about We Hate Monsters?
Wait, we have to give the rating. Like, let's do the the Japanese Dance Dance Revolution rating.
So I think we should do maybe like a final thoughts on the Aboleth.
What if let's do final thoughts.
Your ranking or something.
Maybe our ranking should be between a D4 to a D20, right? Like, would you rate this a D4? No, I'm just gonna say, would you rate this a D4, a D6, a D8, a D10, D12, or a D20?
But is the lower die better, or is it because everyone has their favorite die? Like, I love D4s, and I hate D20s, and I love D10s.
What about
D12s?
What about if you just did like 2 thumbs up, 1 thumb up, 1 thumb down, or 2 thumbs down?
No, I like it that the Dance Dance Revolution ratings. You have F through S.
No, Andy.
Is this an S class? Well, no, Andy. No. We all love anime, but some of us don't love anime as much as you. Yeah, thumbs up, thumbs down is fine with me.
Izuku to Gentle Criminal.
Gentle Criminal's the highest, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know what that is. So I will rate the Aboleth Izuku.
Yeah.
Okay, do you guys want to go around and say your final thoughts
Yeah.
Yeah,
on
let's
the
do it.
Aboleth,
James, you
and
do it.
then
You first.
Okay, me first. So my final thoughts on the Aboleth is, although I think the God hating thing is kind of shoehorned in there, and ultimately it's kind of like it to me that's kind of like a hand wave thing. Everything else about the Aboleth is so good for building a first chapter in a campaign, or for seeking out ancient knowledge that has been lost to time. And that can be really put anywhere in your campaign, whether it's high level or low level. And anyone trying to use the Aboleth in their game needs to be aware of their character's desires, so that way when you ultimately probe into the party's minds, you're going to know what you're probing for. And that leaves me to believe I give the Aboleth a thumbs up.
one thumb.
I would say
How many
a th-
tentacles?
No,
a
just
thumb
do
and a
it letter
half.
grade. No, letter grade. Do a letter grade. We can't do thumbs and a half because then I'll give 3/4 of
No,
one thumb
not
up
no no
and
no
half
no
of
no.
the other
Who's
thumb
doing?
up.
No one's doing half thumbs. I just said 2 thumbs up, 1 thumb down, or 2 thumbs down.
I give
No,
it.
no, no.
I give this a
Let's
B
do a
plus.
grade.
This
Letter
is
grade.
definitely
Okay.
a B plus.
B
As
plus
far as
monster.
monsters go,
Okay.
B plus monster.
Okay. Uh,
And Nick, you
Andy.
Okay. I'll go because Nick has to be last
go. Okay,
for
Andy, you go.
dramatic effect. Okay. So I also agree. Oh,
Why
what?
don't you go, Andy?
Okay.
Wait, I have 2 other final thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I also agree the God thing is really lame. I don't know why they put that in there. It's really dumb. Okay. But besides that point, I think this leads to a great, I think more so than what James thinks, I think this leads to a great final villain, mastermind person, very like intrigue, politics. And also you can do things of horror in it, which I like. Good fighting, interesting abilities. The only downside really is just since it's an aquatic creature, it can limit where it is in your adventure. So that being said, I'm going to give the Aboleth an A minus for Aboleth.
A minus lith.
An A minolith.
A minolith. It's a baby Aboleth.
Very nice. I'm gonna disagree with both of you guys. I think that this 135 HP challenge rating 10 creature with a 10-foot regular movement speed could be a challenge for any of the challenge rating 30 gods. Of course, I think the Aboleths still crying about having lost this war need to move on.
Hey, they
because
can't forget, dude. They can't forget it.
They can't
forget. They're constantly haunted by when the gods used to fucking shove them in their underwater lockers in their Aboleth cities.
The gods are really like, Jesus, just let it go.
Right? Yeah, really. They didn't even remember that guy. I don't even remember him. Yeah, I think if you are looking for an atypical D&D monster, that's why I think it's really cool that we're starting with this one, because it feels very not D&D to me, which is why I really like it. If you were looking for your atypical Lovecraftian horror creature, an Aboleth is perfect, despite the very, I think, mundane lamprey-esque drawing of it. I think this absolutely falls into the very small category of monsters that are mastermind monsters. In the Monster Manual, I think there's very few non-humanoids that can fit that role. I think the Aboleth works very well as like an end of mid, kind of tier campaign boss. I think its enslave abilities really lend itself to like a lot of building paranoia. Um, I really like the idea of doing this kind of small town or sewer system or something where people, in the middle of the night are grabbed and like dragged down into the sewers to then be enslaved by the Aboleth, and then they're missing. It's almost like an invasion of the body snatchers kind of thing. So very horror themed. Um, a lot of heavy opportunity for role playing with this monster. And still not indestructible either. Like accessible hit points. It doesn't have any resistances or immunities. Like you could take this thing out certainly. I agree with Andy that I think its main limitation is that it has to be near water. I mean, you put this thing in like a fishbowl and it's going to be a joke.
Desert.
Yeah, put it in a desert. It's a ranger. Its favorite terrain is desert. So I think it is a really great monster. I'm gonna give the Aboleth. What's the highest? A plus?
A
I'm
plus.
gonna say an A+.5.
A plus and one
A,
tentacle.
yeah, I was gonna say
Yeah.
A plus and half a thumb.
Yeah.
I'm gonna give this Aboleth a big ol' slimy A.
Yeah.
I think it is a great monster.
Yeah, I think
Well,
so too. I only gave it the
un-
minus because of the gods thing.
Oh, okay. Yep, fair.
Mhm.
Well, until we meet next time on Monster Meets,
It's like a hookup.
this
Hookup for monsters.
Monster meets. The Aboleths are swiping
Yeah.
on that.
Swipe with
We-
the
I'm
swipe
swiping
button.
that's what we
right
should-
for
yeah,
the
that's- yeah.
Aboleth.
I think we all swipe right for the Aboleth. All
Wait,
right,
are we saying is it a? Wait, we have the pronunciation thing. Hold
it's
on.
Aboleth.
Let's see.
It's Aboleth.
Aboleth.
Yeah.
Well, that was clear. It's Aboleth.
I can't wait for everyone to listen to this episode and then to be just cringe at every single time Nick is saying Aboleth,
Well,
and they're like,
Nick does
well,
a great job of always saying things wrong.
never
like
never
Valaki.
listen never listening to this anymore because that one guy mispronounced the monster every single time.
I'm sorry, everyone, that I'm using the old gods pronunciation. That is how the gods refer to them
That's
in
the
their
Oh.
war.
speech.
In their war that everyone remembers.
all-
That is the
all-
deep speech pronunciation.
all
of
the gods
Aboleth is
all the
Aboleth.
gods are up there like, hey, you know what would really piss them off? Let's start calling them Aboleths
Yeah.
instead of Aboleths.
Yeah.
That'll really get them going. And they've never forgotten. All right, well, until we meet again on Monster Meets or Monster Talks, or
We're gonna find a better name.
the trio meets with monsters,
Monster Mash.
Monster Mash. We'll talk again later. Bye, everybody.